Lecture. I am grateful today that we have another speaker here today. The Jack Mullen Lecture has been in existence here at UMBC for about 20 years. Almost every year we've been able to bring in some very excellent speakers, and I'm grateful today that we can bring in another. So we have David Autor from MIT Economics. He has won prizes for his contributions in labor economics. And here he is, without delay.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm honored to be invited, and thank you to so many of you for taking part of your Thursday afternoon to be here. So I'm going to talk about, can't hear. Okay, I'll stand closer to the microphone. All right, so I'm gonna talk about technology and the changes in the structure of jobs. And before we begin, let me just say that I realize we have 1 hour. Is that correct? Okay. I'm happy to take questions. I will try to leave room for questions at the end, but I'm also happy for people to raise their hand and ask questions partway through. In fact, I prefer that because then I know what's clear and what's of interest and what's offensive. So let me just introduce. So the name of the talk is, will the workplace of the future have any workers? And this actually refers to, this talk is about popular anxiety about the employment consequences of automation. And the title specifically refers to, I was listening to Marketplace Radio one afternoon, and they were talking about automation manufacturing, and someone said to the interviewer, the workplace of the future is only going to have two workers, a man and a dog. And the man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to make sure the man doesn't touch the equipment. And I thought that was very well put. Not that accurate, but certainly encapsulated a lot of the anxiety that people feel. So let me tell you what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to talk about technology and jobs and what has people concerned. Then I'm going to talk a little about the history of this set of concerns, and that we are not the first generation to have been worried about whether technology would eliminate employment. Then I'm going to talk specifically about computerization in employment and what's different about computerization relative to other eras of technological change and how they've reshaped labor markets. And specifically, I'm going to talk about what I call Polanyi's paradox, refers to a Hungarian philosopher. And I will just tell you a little bit more about him later on. And then I'm going to talk about implications of some very basic observations he made for both employment and for earnings. And they actually have, and the implications are quite different, actually. And then in the last 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk specifically about the sort of frontier of automation and computerization and how a lot of this will be retrospective. What has been accomplished? What does it mean? But I'm going to talk about what are the challenges that lie ahead, and hopefully paint a somewhat informative portrait of where things are moving and what are the challenges and what you can expect to see in the very near future. Okay, so let me say that we're in what I would call an era of automation anxiety. So my colleagues at the Sloan School, Eric Brynjolfsson and Andy McAfee, have two recent books. One is called Race Against the Machine, which my daughters tell me is a reference to Rage Against the Machine, the rock band. Thank you. And the second one is called The Second Machine Age. And these basically posit the concern that technology is moving so fast that workers are going to be left behind by it. And they're not the only ones to make this remark. Paul Krugman, in a column not too long ago, had an article about the rise of the robots. And he said that inequality was due to a combination of robber barons and robots. And they made sort of common wisdom about education as a way to make a living. They made that wisdom obsolete. And it's not hard to sort of begin to feel like, well, maybe we're kind of entering the sort of PC era of workplace robotics. So, back around 1982, when you guys were many of you were not even born, the computers started appearing on people's desktops. So the first computers were expensive. They were clunky. They didn't do much. But within a few years, they became cheap and commonplace, and now, of course, they're ubiquitous and indispensable. And that was all in the course of 30 years. And maybe we're about to head down that cost curve again into an era where we'll have robotic appliances, robotic servants, robotic workers doing many, many tasks that we used to think of as being exclusively human tasks. And so, if you wanted further evidence of this, you could go to the web page of Rethink Robotics. And here's Baxter, a machine designed to replace minimum wage workers doing assembly line tasks. And you'll notice Baxter is only $25,000, which is pretty cheap, although it doesn't include an extended warranty at that price. So buyer beware. Similarly, you could imagine we're entering the Terminator era of robotics. This is the iRobot Warrior, and it's used by the U.S. military primarily for bomb disfusal, which often means it goes up to the bomb and gets blown up. But that's one way to defuse a bomb. This is a weaponized one, which is relatively rare. So let me talk a little about this history. So I think a lot of people respond to this. Now, I should say, by the way, one thing you'll notice about these robots is you see a lot more articles and stories about robots than you see robots, right? In your day-to-day, how many of you encountered a robot today? Yeah. Okay, so there's a little more hype to this than is perhaps warranted. But nevertheless, we're moving that direction. So let me talk about the history of this. So the instance that most people talk about when they think about anxiety about automation and the way it might affect labor markets are the Luddites, who were 19th century skilled weavers in Britain, and particularly Manchester, who rose up against the power frame. The power frame was a water-powered loom that allowed fabrics to be made much more efficiently. And instead of using the artisanal skills of skilled weavers, it relied much more on capital, water power, and children operating the looms. And the Luddites were quite understandably concerned that this would mean a reduction in their livelihoods and perhaps a reduction in employment overall. And they were right and they were wrong. In the sense they were right in that it did reduce the demand for weavers and people with those artisanal tasks, and did allow artisanal tasks to be replaced by relatively less skilled labor. And a lot of that happened throughout the industrial era, throughout the age of mass automation, which was skilled work replaced by machinery and machine operatives who were in many ways less highly trained in doing that work. What they were not right about, of course, was the advent of the power loom and all of the weaving technologies that followed it did not reduce employment in aggregate. Right? What it did was it made cloth cheaper. It made it cheaper for people to have clothing, for the poor to replace their clothing every couple of years, for example, and in general increased prosperity. And created all kinds of other opportunities. When people were better clothed, they probably also were in better health, they were better insulated, and their quality of life improved. And in general, it led to other forms of economic growth. But purely from the perspective of weavers and skilled weavers, it definitely was a disadvantageous development. But you don't have to go back 2 centuries to find these examples. So in 1964, President Lyndon Johnson established the Blue Ribbon National Commission on Technology, Automation, and Economic Progress. And the concern of the commission was the productivity problem. And the productivity problem was that productivity was growing too fast. It's a nice problem to have, right? They were concerned that after the end of the Second World War, with all the advances that had occurred, that productivity would grow so fast that there just wouldn't be enough employment. And this machine here is the Milwaukee-Matic Industrial Machining Tool of 1963. It's quite an imposing device, sort of represents the sense, and you can see just how important this is because the guy is wearing a lab coat. So clearly, this is he's right up there with a BMW line worker. They're also issued lab coats the day they start. And so in that time, the ad hoc Commission on the Triple Revolution, which included Jacob Heilbronner, who is an economist and economic historian, Linus Pauling, the Nobel laureate, and Gunnar Myrdal, the eminent sociologist, wrote an open letter to the president. The traditional link between jobs and incomes is being broken. They were concerned about what we would do with all this abundance. And the Department of the Interior wrote a report on the leisure crisis, Leisure, thought by many to be the epitome of paradise, may well become the most perplexing problem of the future. And you may say, well, why did the Department of Interior, why were they writing about the leisure crisis? Well, it's because they operate the national parks, and they're going to have to handle this, there's overwhelming, this leisure-starved or leisure-engorged class of Americans who would be swarming the national parks with all their free time. And so, looking back at this history, you see these persistent themes of concern about how automation will reduce demand for labor and create a crisis of lack of opportunity. There just won't be things for people to do to earn a living. And that's important because there are really two sides to this. I think many people would say, you see this in the Department of Interior's report, everyone understands that becoming more productive in some sense relieves people of work, and so in theory it creates leisure. Leisure on its own is not a bad thing. However, people need a way to make an income. And so the real concern is not leisure, but it ought to be labor scarcity. Your earnings, the most valuable asset you have and will have for your careers is your human capital, right? The skills that you have that are scarce, that the market will pay you for and reward you for. And if somehow if we immediately develop technology that could do exactly what you do for much less, your skills would be less scarce, right? Your ability to command a living over the course of your career would be reduced. So leisure is not the problem. The problem is labor scarcity, right? The problem is, will people's skills become valueless because we can develop machinery that does those same activities for less? And moreover, once that machinery is developed, will it be the case that people will not have anything else left to do that is highly valuable? Right? So one, they're displaced, and two, they can't move into something else valuable. Well, so to put this in a little further perspective, during the period in which we have experienced the fastest rate of economic growth and the fastest rate of automation in all of human history, which is really the last century, things have mostly gone in the right direction. So this shows you between 1901 and 2002 income in real 1901 dollars for the U.S., New York City, and Boston. It's hard to get consistent series on this, and you can see from this figure that average annual incomes went from about $700 a year to about $3,000. Right, so that's in 1901 dollars, but the important thing to see is that's a four-fold increase in earnings. And another way to see how big a change that is to look at the share of income. Oh, see, there'll still be things for people to do. That's what I did wrong. Okay. All right, back where we started. Look at the share of income spent on food, clothing, and housing, basically necessities, right? Went from 80 to 85% of all income over the course of a century to approximately half, and would be lower still. So that leaves the other 40 to 45% for consumer electronics. In the same time period, employment rates have risen, not fallen. So if you look at male employment to population rates, at least through 1990, they are relatively high and relatively stable. They've been about 84%, fallen to about 77%. In general, that's not a bad thing, right? That means people retire a bit earlier. People who have disability are less likely to work. Not everybody has to work if they can afford not to. At the same time, women's employment rates have gone from under 18%, at least employment in the formal labor market. It's important to recognize that throughout this time, women have been working, but primarily working in the home, have gone from 18% to almost 60%. And so despite all this growth, despite all this prosperity, despite all this automation, we've had rising rates of market participation, rising fraction of the population earning an income through market activity. So then the next question is that about to change, right? So you can look at that history and say, sure, that was then, but perhaps this time is different. And I'm not going to tell you that it couldn't be different, right? It could be different, but I'm going to talk about in what ways it might be different. Let me start by pointing out that we are not in by any stretch of the imagination, the first major technological revolution that we have undergone recently. So in 1840, almost 70% of all US employment was in agriculture, right? At present, that's under 2%, right? So that was in 20, so it's about 2%. So 35-fold reduction in the share of employment in agriculture. And even by 1900, that was 40%. And in 1950, it was 11%. So we've had a dramatic decline in employment in agriculture. And the reason is technological, primarily, right? The combination of fertilizer, irrigation, and genetics, right, has dramatically increased, and also other like agricultural technologies like tractors and so on, has dramatically increased productivity. So it's not that we've run out of taste for food, but we require many fewer people to do it. Even though the nation, of course, is many-fold larger in terms of population, even though we are a net exporter of food to the rest of the world, right? We do all that with 2% of the population. So despite all evidence to the contrary, it seems that there is finite demand for food. And so as productivity has risen in agriculture, eventually employment has declined. So where has it gone? Well, the first place it went to was industry and manufacturing. So at the end of the Second World War, slightly over 40% of all US employment was in manufacturing, was in making goods. But then that also has been in decline. So the share of employment in industry, which includes manufacturing broadly stated, has fallen from 35% to 20%. And if you looked at manufacturing narrowly construed, be under 10% of US employment at this point. So instead, employment has moved into so-called services, right? Services is an incredibly broad category. It's sort of everything from software to hospitals, right? So it includes business services, it includes healthcare, it includes education, it includes foods and restaurants, it includes engineering services, right? So this very, very broad catch-all. But it's important to recognize as these changes occurred, they were not painless and they were not automatic, right? So the movement out of agriculture, which occurred largely in the first half of the 20th century, right, was accompanied by a recognition at the time that things were changing. And in fact, the farm states, like Iowa, for example, were the leaders in responding to that change. And the way they responded was through education. The US, and led by the farm states, was the first country to send its full population of youth through high school. And the high school movement, which happened between the 1880s and was done by 1940, was the idea that every citizen should be compelled to stay in school till at least age 16 and should be expected to complete high school. And that was actually quite a radical idea at the time, and in fact was considered frivolous from the perspective of many other advanced countries. Because one, why does everyone need such an elite education? What are they all going to do with it? It wasn't clear why everyone needed to be numerate or even completely literate when so much work just required physical labor. And there was also concern that really maybe it just was asking too much of people. Is it really realistic to think that most people could become that educated, right? Could enter the elite of having had 12 years of completed schooling? The farm states led the way because they recognized that their kids were not going to be working on the farm, and they were going to need different skills and to be more adaptable to move into industry. And so this was a big idea, and it paid off well. In fact, many economists, I think, would attribute US preeminence, economic preeminence in the 20th century to having the most educated and flexible population of any country at that time, a position that we have soundly moved away from in the intervening years. The US was, at the turn of, in approximately the 1980s, also had the largest proportion of population that had gone through a four-year college degree. Now the US is approximately 12th to 14th in the world. Okay, and again, I should say, so that was one movement. As we moved out of industry into services, we also continued to educate ourselves to move people from doing physically intensive work to more mentally abstract and cognitively challenging work. And many of these advances were made possible by labor-saving automation. And now the question I want to ask is, well, what is distinctive about the current era? So many people think we're in a different era of automation, right? There was the era of the of the automobile, of the steam engine, of electrification. There's the era of mass production, and now we're in the computer era. What is distinctive about this area, and what does that imply for changes in the nature of work? So to answer that question or pose that question very concretely, I'm going to discuss what I think of, and what I think many think of, as the very first computer, and this is the Jacquard loom of 1801. And what made this loom different from other machines that preceded it is that it was effectively a symbolic processor, meaning that it acted on stored representations of information. So what you see, these cards are effectively a program for weaving, right? They are a set of instructions to the loom about which arms to pick up, which threads to use, what pattern to weave into fabric. And these, if you look at these cards, they're not a picture per se of what the fabric is supposed to look like. They are a set of instructions, right? And so this notion of storing instructions, of encapsulating a set of symbols that then give effectively commands or steps, was a very powerful idea, an extremely original idea. The Jacquard loom actually was the inspiration to Herman Holrith, who invented the paper punch card, which was used to read the 1890 US Census, the first machine-read census of populations. He joined up later with Thomas Watson to found IBM. This machine was actually just to give you a sense of its sophistication, there is a surviving set of cards by Jacquard, the developer of the Jacquard loom. It's 10,000 cards long, and it weaves a silk portrait of Jacquard. So it's like a selfie in silk. Okay. So what has changed? So the reason I want to say that this is the first computer, what makes it a computer, is a symbolic processor, and it acts on stored representations, stored programs. And once those programs once the steps are codified, the machine carries them out with high degree of accuracy and an extremely low cost. Right? It follows the procedure, the rules, probably better than any individual person could do. So what has changed in the intervening 200 years? Well, many, many things have changed. Your computer doesn't look quite like this one, although I would argue it's pretty much the same idea. But one thing that has changed a lot is the cost of executing stored instructions. So this is a figure from a paper by Bill Norhaus, who's an eminent economic historian and energy and environmental economist at Yale. And he tried to calculate the real cost of performing 1 million standardized instructions between 1850 and 2010 or 2007. This is a logarithmic scale, meaning each one of these, a downward movement of one bar is a 100-fold decline from the previous level. And you can see from 1850 to about 1950, there's almost no change in that cost. So although people are get better at calculating, wages are rising, and so the actual cost of doing 1 million calculations isn't really changing much. And then in the 1950s, we get the vacuum tube, which is used for the very first computers, right, which were used heavily in World War II, both for cracking the German Enigma code and also for the development of fissile material. And then in the 1970s, we enter the in the 1970s we enter the transistor era, and then the integrated circuit era, and the microprocessor era. These are all basically ways a vacuum tube is like a switch. It's like a binary device, except that it's done with gases and electrodes. It's slow and it's expensive, and it's cool. I don't know if you've ever, if any of your parents have their old vacuum tube audio systems around, but they look like something from a kind of a Frankenstein movie with the glowing orbs. Anyway, and then. So the main point is not that vacuum tubes are cool, but that the price of accomplishing 1 million instructions falls approximately 2 trillion-fold in this era, right? So this basic idea of computing goes from being a practical way to do some weaving to an all-purpose way of anything that we can figure out how to program and codify and calculate, we can now do it at nearly infinitesimal cost. Right? And so that opens an era where we had the possibility of codifying instructions, of codifying tasks, and getting machines to carry them out for us. And here's one example of that. This is actually from the Manhattan Project in World War II. So this was the Manhattan Project was the project that developed the atom bomb in Nevada in the U.S. in New Mexico, excuse me. And these are the women who are operating the machines that are used to simulate implosions, which was part of the process of development. And actually, the name of their jobs was calculators. They were called calculators. And so this notion of codifying tasks, right, creates enormous possibilities. Anything that we know the steps, that we know the procedure from front to back, we could potentially get a computer to simulate for us. So for example, if you know how to calculate, if you know how to file information, if you know how to sort and retrieve, if you know how to follow a set of steps to calculate the molecular weight of a chemical process and so on, all of those steps can be written up as code. Once that procedure has been codified, it can then almost surely be done more cheaply and more accurately and more rapidly by a machine. So the question is, why isn't everything computerized then, right? If it's so cheap and it's so fast, it's so attractive, why don't we have computers doing all the things we do as opposed to just some of the things we do? So here I'll draw your attention to Michael Polanyi, who is a Hungarian philosopher and scientist. And he wrote a book in 1966 called The Tacit Dimension. And he made the following observation. We know more than we can tell. And he goes on to elaborate. The skill of a driver cannot be replaced by a thorough schooling in the theory of the motor car. Or let me kind of put that much more concretely. If you wanted to teach your children how to ride a bicycle, you probably wouldn't sit them down with a PowerPoint and a lecture and talk to them for 8 hours about how to do that, and then just send them out on their bike and tell them to go, ride to their heart's content, right? And the reason for that is because many of the skills that we learn and master, we learn tacitly. In other words, without an explicit procedure, we learn them through other cognitive capabilities when it comes to how to speak in, how to use spoken language, how to recognize faces in a room, how to pick up a soft object and determine what its properties are, how to develop a new idea or write a persuasive argument, how to produce a hypothesis as an explanation for a set of phenomena that you observe. All of these things are tasks that we carry out, but we don't know the explicit, in many cases, we don't know the explicit procedure for doing them, right? We understand them tacitly, but we don't understand them explicitly. And that has two very important implications for thinking about how automation, and particularly computerization, may interact with human skills. One is a technical implication, which is that we can't automate readily what we don't explicitly understand, right? If we don't know the procedure, if we don't know the rules, we can't write a program that simulates what we do, right? So if we don't know how we go about forming hypotheses, it's hard to write a computer program that forms hypotheses. If we don't understand how we recognize faces in a room or see someone aged 15 and meet them again 30 years later and recognize that it's the same person even though their facial features have changed, their hair color has changed, and so on. If we don't know the procedure for doing that, it's hard for us to write a program to do that, right? So many tasks, as I will argue in a minute, have not been automated because we only understand them tacitly. We do not understand them explicitly. So that's the simple mechanical implication. The economic implication of that is actually more subtle and at least equally important, which is that many tasks that are not substituted, that we can't directly replace, they are not unaffected by computerization, they are complemented by it. That is, they benefit, I'll get to your question in just one sec, they potentially benefit from the technological advancement. So let me say more concretely, many things that we do require a mixture of skills. They require perspiration and inspiration, brains and brawn. They require both empathy and technical understanding. So if you're a doctor, you both have to understand patients and you have to understand bodies, right? And those are two different things. The patient is the person, the body is the thing the person occupies. When we get better at doing one of those things, assuming they need to both be done, we often increases the value of doing the other, right? So if I'm a good doctor and I know how to interact with patients, and then I develop a set of procedures that make me more efficient at diagnosing, that doesn't make me less valuable or less necessary as a doctor. That makes me better, right? That increases my value at doing this other thing, right? Because it doesn't. You don't say, well, since I can diagnose well, I don't need to interact with the patients, right? In fact, those tasks are potentially complementary, and so this point becomes important, I'll come back to in a moment, in thinking about why mechanization doesn't just replace us, it simultaneously, in many cases, makes us more valuable. Yes, you had a question?
So do you need to know how to
In general, I think the answer to that is yes. Not absolutely. So, I mean, there are two exceptions to that. One is that you may not need to know how a person does the task to find another way to do it that uses a different mechanism, right? So when a computer plays chess, it plays it quite differently from how a human plays chess, right? Because humans don't have that kind of exhaustive calculation capability. They use much more heuristics and pattern recognition, right? So one answer is you may find a way to simulate the task that doesn't do it the same way the human mind does it. That's clearly happens all the time. There's no reason that when we have a machine do something, it has to do it the way we do. Just like airplanes don't flap their wings, right? They just use jet engines. The other possibility is that you may be able to develop machines that figure things out, right? That learn on their own. This is the notion of so-called machine learning, which I'll talk about at the end, where a machine, we don't tell it the task, we show it some examples, and then it infers the rules, right? So those would be the broad exceptions to that statement. And those exceptions are important. And so the point I want to make is that this is not absolute, but rather it constrains the rate of progress on problems. Problems that we already understand explicitly, like calculating, like filing, like sorting, like all kinds of information and repetitive motion tasks, quickly succumbed to automation or were quickly automated. Tasks that don't fall into that domain, that require much more tacit understanding, have proved much more challenging. And the strategies for addressing them are things I'll actually talk a little bit about at the end. Okay, good. So let me relate this to employment now. And this is kind of a big leap. But first let me just talk about the types of jobs and how that's changing. So here I have plotted the percentage changes in employment by broad categories of occupations for the 33-year period from 1979 to 2012. On the left side of this plot are what are called personal service occupations. So these are personal care, food and cleaning, protective service. So, restaurant workers, home health aides, security guards, flight attendants, movers, right? And you can see that these jobs are growing relatively rapidly. And the fact that they're growing faster than ones in the middle means they're also growing as a share of employment. As you move to the center, operatives and laborers, production workers, office clerical workers, and sales workers, these jobs are contracting as a share of employment. And if we move to the right, professional, technical, and managerial jobs, these are highly educated jobs, these are all growing. Now, what distinguishes them in very, very rough terms are the jobs in the middle that are contracting are jobs that to a very substantial extent follow routine codifiable tasks. So many clerical office administrative jobs, many sales jobs, many repetitive production jobs, right? They follow relatively well-scripted procedures. It doesn't mean they're not skilled by traditional standards, right? So being a clerical worker, knowing how to type and file and calculate, being a production worker, knowing how to move materials and correctly assemble things, those are real skills. However, because the procedures are relatively explicit, they have been automated relatively rapidly. If you look on the right side of this figure, managers, professionals, technicians, these jobs are intensive in what some would call abstract tasks. They're things that require creativity, problem solving, complex interactions with others. And these jobs are not readily substituted because the essential skills are ones that we understand relatively tacitly rather than explicitly. And so those have grown numerically, and arguably they're also complemented, right? So if you're a doctor, if you're an attorney doing legal research, if you're an economist doing statistical analysis, if you're someone in marketing trying to figure out how to target consumers, you arguably become more productive because a lot of the information processing tasks that you might have spent your time on previously will be done very cheaply and rapidly by machinery. On the left-hand side of the figure, these personal care, food, cleaning, protective service occupations, these are not highly skilled jobs by conventional standards. They generally don't require high levels of education. Many people can be productive at them in a number of hours of training or 1 or 2 days. Right? They're growing numerically because they perform important functions for people, but they are not readily susceptible to automation. Right? There's a reason that, for example, when you get a new car at the showroom, the windshield has certainly been installed by a robot, right, on an assembly line. If someone were to break the windshield on your car when it was parked in front of your house, they would not send a robot out to fix it, right? They would send someone out in a truck who would come and manually remove the pieces of the frame, right, and retrofit a new window, and it would actually require a lot more dexterity and flexibility than a robot could potentially provide, right? And so these jobs draw on a set of skills, human skills about adaptability and flexibility that are hard to automate, right? They require some degree of spoken language, some degree of common sense, some degree of navigating an unfamiliar environment, right? There's a reason that your vacuum cleaner doesn't walk upstairs, right? There's a reason that even if you own a Roomba, you still own a vacuum cleaner, right? Which is that a separate vacuum cleaner, because that requires a kind of dexterity and adaptability that is at present really challenging to automate. And also, equally important, these jobs are not readily outsourced, right? Because many of them need to be done in person. Right? You can't walk into a barbershop and have a telepresent hair cutter in Vietnam cut your hair, right? You need, at least at present, it's going to be someone working in that barbershop. So this U shape of this figure is what some call employment polarization, which is that we have a growth of highly skilled, highly educated jobs, the jobs that you are all training for being here, and those offer abundant opportunity and rising productivity. We also have a growth of relatively low education skills that draw on these tacit capabilities that most people have, that machines find hard to have machines supply, and these are growing, and these are not high-wage jobs, and I'll talk about why in a second, but they're growing numerically. And then in the middle, we see this decline of what many would have thought of as middle-educated career jobs, either blue-collar production jobs or white-collar office clerical jobs. And so this polarization, I think, has a lot of people understandably concerned, because it suggests that, it could remind you of many other phenomena in inequality, right, where we have growing mass at the top and growing mass at the bottom and not much in the middle. Okay, and let me say that this is not just a US phenomenon. So if you look across European Union economies, this, over the period of 1993 to 2010, this is dictated by data availability. This is not the period you would otherwise optimally choose. This lines countries up from Ireland to Portugal according to the decline in middle-paying jobs as a share of employment. So you can see in all 16 of these countries, this red bar corresponds to middle-paying jobs. These are basically production jobs, office jobs, clerical jobs. In all of these countries, as a share of employment, on the one hand, you have the growth of the blue bar. Those are basically in-person and manual positions, right? Many of those cleaning positions, food service positions, and then the green bar, which is technical, professional, and managerial, right? So the point I want to make is this hollowing out of employment is at least a decline of these middle skill jobs is something that we see across a lot of countries. So this is not something specific about the Obama administration or the Bush administration or the minimum wage or the Affordable Care Act. This is something that's probably more broadly technologically based. So now the next question is, what does this mean for earnings? Right? What does this mean for what people work? So you might imagine, you say, well, okay, we have a growth of these high education jobs and a growth of these low education in-person jobs. Should those all be growing in wages as well as employment, right? And here the answer is actually more subtle. So it really depends on three factors. One is substitution versus complementarity, right? So if your job tasks are directly substituted and there's nothing else that you can do, right, then that's not good news for you. So if you're a paper and pencil draft person and CAD software, computer-aided design software is introduced, if you can learn to use CAD software, chances are you can produce more in a day, right? You may actually be more productive. If, on the other hand, you say, well, I'm going to stick with paper and pencil, and that's where it's at, that's going to be a harder way to make a living, okay? So one is complementarity versus substitution. A second factor, which is important, is the elasticity of final demand for what you do. So for example, in some areas, when productivity grows, employment grows. In some activities, when productivity grows, employment shrinks. So in agriculture, when productivity grew enough over a long enough period of time, employment actually contracted. In healthcare, when productivity grows, seemingly employment grows as well, right? As you know, healthcare as a share of national income has risen from a few percentage points to over, I think, approximately 15 percentage points in the US, right? And this is during a time when doctors have gotten much more productive, right? It used to be, 50, 70 years ago, going to a doctor was not obviously going to improve your health. It might do just the opposite. Presently, there are many, many more things that the medical world can do for you, and yet that hasn't reduced our demand for medical care, it's increased it, right? So that's the second factor, is how does overall demand for this activity rise or fall as productivity grows? And then finally, the most important one actually is about labor supply. So I pointed out that these growths in professional, technical, and managerial these jobs are growing. Well, one reason, wages have been growing right along with those quantities, right? Quantities and prices moving in the same direction. One important reason is that there's a limited supply of people who are trained to do those activities. So when demand for software engineers rises, you can't become a software engineer overnight, right? It takes some significant skill. When demands for attorneys rises, it takes several years to go to law school. And so as demand rises in those activities, wages tend to rise too, at least in the short to medium term. On the other hand, when we think about these jobs like food service, like cleaning, flight attendants, driving vehicles, performing security, demand rises, the quantity of people needed in those jobs rise, but the supply of people who can potentially do that work is very, very large because it doesn't require specialized skills and training, right? They use relatively generic skills that people in good health with modest levels of education can supply. And so that tends to mean that the growth of the left-hand tail, as I was talking about, will lead to a lot of jobs, but they won't necessarily be high-paying jobs. And that's, in fact, what we see. So this figure is comparable to the one I showed you a moment ago for employment, but now this is about earnings. Okay? And what you see on the right-hand side is disproportionately large growth of earnings in professional, technical, and managerial jobs. Right? In the service occupations on the left, there was some earnings growth, but that slowed down or became negative over the last 15 years. Why? Well, overall economic slackness, of slack in the economy, relatively high rates of unemployment, relatively low rates of growth, meant that workers were abundantly available to do those jobs. So even as the quantity of them rose, labor supply was so abundant that wages did not rise. And that's particularly true because employment was declining in the middle, which then has the tendency of making people downwardly mobile into these positions, right? So the thinking about this in terms of employment, or what I talked about, the concern about employment, the concern you might have looking at these figures is not that there aren't jobs or won't be jobs, right? But that those jobs may not be good jobs, right? By and large, over the course of more than a century, most of the thrust of automation has been to remove drudgery and allow people to have safer, less physically demanding, more intellectually engaging jobs, right? Indoor work without heavy lifting. The thrust of automation over the last 30 years, surprisingly, has been to eliminate cognitively skilled jobs and some physically skilled jobs and replace them with a mixture of highly cognitively skilled jobs and jobs that actually are closer to primarily physical activities. Okay. And one manifestation of this, and I don't want to claim that this is the entire source of it, has been this kind of divergence of earnings levels between high educated and low educated workers. So this figure shows you real indexed earnings levels between 1964 and 2012 for 5 education groups. People with post-college education, i.e., MBA, a PhD, a JD, an MD. People with exactly a 4-year college education. People with some college but no 4-year degree, people with only a high school degree, and people with less than a high school degree. And what you can see, a number of things. First of all, since 1980, these lines have been diverging. I've mentioned this on the left is men, this on the right is women. These lines have been diverging, but they've been diverging in a particularly unpleasant way, which is not only that the top has been rising, but the bottom has been falling. So the real wages of non-college educated workers have fallen on the order of 10 to 20 percentage points since 1980. And that reflects, in part, an abundance of workers for which there are fewer middle-skill jobs and more low-skill jobs. If you look at the figure for women, by the way, the slope is more positive. In general, throughout this period, women have done better than men. But still, you see this massive divergence. And for the least educated women, real wages have basically not changed in 30 years, which is remarkable, actually, because there's been a lot of economic growth in that period. There's been the average earnings have risen, productivity has risen. It's rare to have so many decades of sustained growth without sustained shared earnings gains. Okay. So, So now I realize I'm down to the last 15 minutes. So let me talk about the future, and particularly, I've told you a story about what has not been automated, and you might legitimately ask, well, okay, that was the past, but now we're in the Terminator era. What is this kind of, or is everything are all bets off? Are things going to now progress so rapidly that 20 years from now you won't recognize the environment you live in because it will be so heavily mechanized? And computerization clearly has progressed into domains that you might not have predicted 20 years ago. It's driving vehicles, right? Computers parse legal documents, right? They read through stacks of papers and try to pick out the themes and organize and catalog what's in them for experts to read. There are some computers that actually perform agricultural field labor. So is this whole notion of what can be codified, is that kind of passé? Well, I'm going to say no. It actually is useful in 2 ways. It explains what has not yet been accomplished, but more important, it illuminates where the frontier lies and how people are trying to move it forward. So there's really 2, and this refers to the question the gentleman asked in the back a few minutes ago. There are 2 ways to overcome this problem of trying to automate tasks that are not well codified. One is what I'm going to call environmental control, and the other is machine learning. So what is environmental control? That's one that may be more familiar to you, although you may not notice it around you, which is in many, many ways, machines aren't very adaptable, and so we adapt the environment to make it machine compatible, right? So, your modern automobile, right, is safe, it's fast, it's reliable, right? And it is absolutely worthless unless you have a flat surface to drive it on, which doesn't really occur very much in nature, right? So an area in the United States the size of Ohio has been paved. I don't mean Ohio, I mean the sum of all the roads come to the surface area of Ohio, right? Why? Well, we've remade the surface of a substantial chunk of the earth to make it car compatible, right? We've simplified the world so that inflexible machinery can function in it and do useful things. Similarly, even many of you hear about the Google car that can, drive in city traffic and so on, and it is a remarkable engineering achievement. However, the Google car, some would say, computer scientists who are my colleagues say, the Google car doesn't drive on roads, it drives on maps. In other words, it operates in a carefully curated environment where people have gone through and tagged all the stoplights, all of the traffic signs, all of the intersections. And the car essentially compares its environment to what's on the map. And obviously, if it sees an obstacle like a moving vehicle or a person walking on the road, it will stop, it'll readjust course. If it gets to an area that doesn't match the map, i.e. the traffic lights have moved, there's a signal man, there's a detour, the car has to stop. It can't in real time adapt itself to that environment. So effectively, you could think of the Google car as being a little bit like a train that drives on invisible tracks. Okay, that's an overstatement, but it's not adaptable in the way that people are adaptable. Let me give a more contemporary example. You might actually, if you were reading the Wall Street Journal today, you also would have seen a picture like this. So these are Kiva robots. Kiva is a company owned by Amazon now. It was an MIT startup. And what it does is it provides warehouse automation. So Amazon and companies that do direct-to-consumer sales operate very, very large warehouses, multi-million square feet. They're often in hot and remote places. And they typically have employed workers who are called pickers, and what those pickers do is they run through shelves getting products as orders come in. That's a hot, sweaty job. Pickers often walk or run 15 to 20 miles a day. They have to be dexterous. They have to be able to climb up to places to get things. They have to have good visual recognition. They need to recognize what an object is. And they have to be able to deal with heat because these warehouses are too large to cost-effectively air condition. There is no machine replacement for a picker. There is no robot that you could buy at any feasible or imaginable economic cost that would do what they do. So what Kiva's idea was let's reorganize the warehouse to make it more like a filing cabinet. A filing cabinet is something that a machine can work with. And what we're going to do is where human dexterity is required, we're going to minimize that and concentrate it in just a couple of places. So the way that works is as objects come in into loading docks, there are people who are loaders. They load things onto shelves. What shelves do they load them on? Well, the robots, these orange pods that look like canister vacuum cleaners, they basically they drive under a shelf, they pick it up, and they move it to where the person has the new products. The machine, the centralized dispatching software, then says, points a laser pointer at the shelf, and the worker puts the objects on the shelf. Right? The computer now knows what's on the shelf because it told you to put it there. It assumes that you did so. It then takes the shelves, and the robots drive them into the warehouse and organize them, or the dispatching software organizes the shelves in a way that they think is efficient for the orders that might come in. So if people generally on a Friday night order a case of beer and a box of diapers, it'll put the beer and the diapers together for later restocking. Then as orders come in, so let me say the whole warehouse now is being operated by the robots, which is operated by the scheduler software, or the centralized scheduler software is fine. Then as orders come in, what happens? Well, the robots go and collect, they basically go under the shelves that have the relevant objects, the beer shelf, the diaper shelf, and they line up and bring the stuff to Tim, the human picker. And the laser pointer points again at the objects, and Tim takes them off the shelf, puts them into a box, puts a label on it, and sends it out. And then the robots take the shelves back into the warehouse. Right? So this is a really interesting example of environmental control. Right? There's not the machine flexibility and dexterity to do these tasks. So instead, what Kiva has done is economize on the use of those human skills by turning most of the warehouse into basically an information processing task. Where are objects located? How can we sort them to get them where they need to go? Okay? So that's one kind of example of environmental control, just like paving roads is an example of environmental control to make the world more predictable for machinery. And you can imagine a lot of this will occur. Right? So Maybe people say, well, the Google car won't be able to recognize traffic signals on its own because it doesn't have good eyesight. Well, that's true, but future traffic signals will have little radio frequency IDs so machines can recognize them, right? It's the case that robots right now couldn't operate your dishwasher because they couldn't figure out the controls, but in the future, your dishwasher will be able to talk to the machinery. It doesn't need to be exactly like you, right? So we can adapt the environment. The alternative, or a complement, is there are many other tasks where maybe we don't know the rules, but maybe we could make a machine that could statistically infer those rules. Right? So this is the idea of machine learning, which is using inductive reasoning. So perhaps you could give a computer a large number of examples, perhaps they're curated examples, and then have it study that database, and then try to infer how you got those answers. So here's an example from Google X Labs. And what it does is 16,000 processors were used to comb through a database of over 1 billion images. And then the software just attempted to organize those images into groups. Right? It didn't know what they were, but it tried to find things that belonged together. So one cluster of images it identified was this cluster of things that turned out to be mostly cats. And it's actually kind of funny if you read the article by John Markoff in the New York Times. He said the title of the article is, "How many computers does it take to recognize a cat?" 16,000. And you can see it's not quite perfect at that, right? This is not a cat, right? This is a couple of coffee cups. But that's interesting because you can imagine that no child would have made that error, right? Even though, and people are incredibly good at taking a simple example of something and generalizing into a broader class of things, right? So you can show a child a picture of a bicycle, and then you can show a photograph where you have bent bicycles, you have unicycles, right? You have tricycles, and the child will generally be able to recognize those as all being the same category, right? And would not say, well, this thing looks too round and ceramic-y to be a cat, right? So it turns out to be a genuinely hard problem. Or I'll give you another example. And I recognize I'm short on time. Many of you have heard of the Watson computer Jeopardy. The Watson computer that won on Jeopardy, it's quite an amazing accomplishment. It's also instructive to see what it did wrong. So one of the questions it got wrong, and spectacularly wrong, was the category was U.S. cities, and the question was, its largest airport was named for a World War II hero, and its second largest was named for a World War II battle. Well, the correct answer was Midway Airport in Chicago. The answer that Watson suggested was Toronto, whose second largest airport is Waterloo. Okay. Now, how did that error occur? Well, clearly, there's a category violation, right? Because this is U.S. cities. But if you think about what that machine very likely did, it's as if you typed into Google city, or even U.S. city, 2 airports, 1 name for a battle. And if you typed in that search engine, you would very likely come up with both Chicago and Toronto. Why? Well, because it matches some of those features, right? City, couple airports, battle. All right, it's not in the US, but you didn't say it had to be in the US, right? You just typed all those words into a search engine, right? So this shows, what this exemplifies is kind of the brittleness of the technology, the fact that it's not using the same level of common sense. It's very good at lookup, but it doesn't understand, at least at that time, all the nuances that you would apply to what is essential to the question and what is secondary to the question. Final example in this vein. Question, I gave the example of children recognizing a bicycle. You might think of the same problem of recognizing a chair, right? There are many things that look like chairs. Some of them have 4 legs, some have just a single central leg. Some have a back, some do not have a back, right? And if you try to describe using a simple set of rules what is a chair, you would come up with a lot of things that were chairs and a lot of things that weren't. Like a lot of coffee tables could easily be chairs. So how do you figure out what is a chair? Well, one way you might figure out is by reasoning about it, right? You could look at these 3 objects, a conventional chair, a toilet, and a traffic cone, and you can say, well, they all look sort of chair-like. But reasoning about the human anatomy, you might say, but this one doesn't look that comfortable. And so the point being, actually, that the tools that we use when we solve these types of problems probably is not just a matter of a simple visual pattern recognition. It involves reasoning about what an object is for, how the world works, and so there's a complex model that goes into place to reason about whether something with these general features is likely to be a chair or not. We're thinking about what its purpose is. That's a very great distance away from the machine learning about organizing things that might look like cats. Right? So I just wanted, the point is simply that the problem is hard. That actually the layers of cognition that go into these things are quite sophisticated. That doesn't mean science won't get there, but it does mean that it won't get there overnight. Right? That this class of problems that we solve effortlessly remain amazingly daunting for technology. But let me just give you a counterexample why one can be too pessimistic as well. So here's an article from 1949 in Popular Mechanics talking about the ENIAC, which was one of the first one of the first vacuum tube operated computers, and they boldly predicted that where a calculator on the ENIAC is equipped with 18,000 vacuum tubes and weighs 30 tons, computers in the future may have only 1,000 vacuum tubes and perhaps weigh 1.5 tons. Right? So one can be too pessimistic as well about where this is going to go. Okay, so I'm going to conclude. So the first thing, kind of 4 points I would want to make, or at least 3. One is that the one thing that we do know about the general progress of technological change well over a century is that it has raised demand for cognitive skills. It has made those abstract skills of problem solving, analysis, creativity, intuition, interpersonal communication has increased the value of all of those activities, has complemented them. Right? If you were to take the workforce of the turn of the 20th century, which was about 15% illiterate and substantially innumerate, that workforce would not be very employable in today's economy. Right? We have transformed the environment, or transformed the workplace in a way that places a premium on these skills. And so we have to have had and need to continue to educate ourselves to be relevant for the set of jobs that need to be done. The second is that people routinely and understandably appreciate the complementarities between technology and overstate the substitution. It's obvious that machines substitute for people doing stuff. That's why we make them, right? Because they relieve us of labor. They relieve us of drudgery. No company says, I have this new technology and it's going to complement your high-skilled workers and make them more expensive, right? No one sells it that way. They say it's going to save labor. And yet, over the longer run, what it often does is it does save labor in those tasks and then increases the value of people who can do the complementary tasks, people who can guide and instruct the machinery, people who can decide how to allocate resources, people who can solve new problems, produce new ideas. In 1900, it would have been very hard for farmers who were 40% of employment and recognized that the world was changing to say 100 years from now, all those farmers would be, would-be farmers will be in healthcare, finance, information technology, consumer electronics, and hospitality and leisure and entertainment. It's very hard to predict where these future activities come from. But we've never run out of them in the past. Doesn't mean we couldn't. But so far, when we get good at doing one thing and automate it and raise productivity, we find other interesting things for people to do that draw on human skills. This notion of polarization that I talked about will not continue indefinitely, this sort of decline in the middle. A lot of that has already been done, right? To the degree that middle-skilled jobs survive now, many of them are much more cognitively demanding. To the degree that people have office clerical assistants, they're problem solvers, right? They're not typists. To the degree that people work in factories, they're not primarily, lifting up bottles and putting them down again, right? They're actually operating or programming machines to do those tasks. So polarization will not continue indefinitely. Many of the new middle-skill jobs will actually be cognitively skilled jobs like medical technicians, right? As well as some of the traditional ones like, electrical work, plumbing, construction, et cetera. Finally, people say, well, what has happened in the last decade? Employment growth has been sluggish, wage growth has been sluggish, and that is all true. I'll just opine without really explaining. I don't think computerization is the main factor behind that. I think the bigger factors actually have been demographics and trade, which has been a very big deal. So I for one am not ready to say that this time is different, that this is the period when we should be worried. We should be worried to the extent that we should be educating ourselves to be relevant in the set of skills that will not be that are not readily automated, but that will be a large set and a valuable one for a long period of time going forward. Okay, happy to take any questions. Yes.
So, do you see then if you look at the last 60 to 70 years of economic data, generally this kind of that generalization
Yeah.
that when economies and nation societies are at their best, they're less partisan.
Yep.
And we see, I mean, with your labor polarization, it seems that in part technology is kind of responsible for this sort of wealth gap increase. So you see that the solution, you see the adjustment is painful. You see that the future is kind of a tension, a struggle, and back and forth.
Yeah, so I think you're asking where the question is, is inequality itself a concern, right? In other words, the sort of, greater degree of extreme wealth and greater degree of, low wealth, is that a problem for economic growth or a problem politically, right? And I think, so I would say yes, but on the other hand, I'm on less firm ground in saying so, in the sense that, you can make, I'm happy to make the argument that, a healthy middle class, for one, presents people with a sense of opportunity, right, which in some sense is motivating, and moreover, when wealth is very concentrated, it often leads to political capture, which then leads to bad policy, and that can itself harm growth, right? So I think I am deeply concerned about those things, but I do not have the degree of confidence that says absolutely that has gone wrong. So, for example, the most recent data on the U.S. does not indicate that economic mobility has declined in the last 20 years. In other words, the likelihood, the probability of moving from rags to riches or vice versa hasn't actually fallen, although many people would have predicted it would. Now, it was never high, actually. The U.S. is not a very economically mobile country. It's part of our civic mythology. It's not true, but it hasn't changed very much either. So I personally am very concerned about inequality, and I think one could make kind of investments in the form of insurance against letting it get too extreme, right? And say, well, it could be really risky. We don't want to go there. Let's make sure we're providing adequate resources and adequate transfers. I would be in favor of that. But I don't absolutely know that that is behind our specific economic malaise.
So in your discussion, you talked about things that, thinking about transferring tasks from man to humans to machines.
Yep.
And linking that to inequality trends. What is interesting to me is that a lot of technology has enabled transfer of tasks from humans to other humans, and that's the trade that you talked about in the end.
Yep.
And to what extent does computer technology and shipping and all improve the ability to shift jobs overseas or elsewhere and capture a lot of the increases in the hollowing out polarization?
Sure, absolutely. So there's the sort of degree of global integration that we have now would be inconceivable without the sort of information technology that allows us to effectively coordinate factories around the world, right? So China's incredibly rapid rise over the last couple of decades would have been less impactful for the U.S. economy if it weren't feasible for firms to source so much of their production and have that done quickly and rapidly and bring the products here. So I do think to say trade and technology are not distinct in that sense; they are complementary to a large extent. I think on the positive side, right, this force has reduced world poverty at a more rapid rate over the last 20 years than at any time in human history, right? China's rise has brought at least 400 million people out of, almost destitution. And so in general, this force of trade has been very, very good for much of the world. What it has done is create a lot of competition very rapidly for the US. My own suspicion is that the rate of change has greatly slowed, and that we are now a much more globally integrated world, but I don't see the next 2 decades looking like the last 2 decades. In fact, I think they may, in some sense, even go in the other direction. The U.S. having much cheaper supplies of energy will actually reduce the degree to which we will outsource employment overseas. And it could actually be, and this is something I worry about more, that the sort of robotics will have a larger direct competitive effect on the developing world if we actually developed industrial robots that could make textiles and deal with leather goods, right, and do fine motor assembly. That would be much more devastating for China and Indonesia and Vietnam than it would be for most US workers, right, in terms of that very rapid change. So in general, trade has been a good force. It's been extremely disruptive for the US in the last 20 years, even as it's benefited much of the developing world. It doesn't appear, that rate of change, I think, has greatly slowed. Yes?
So within the next 20 years or so, just as a ballpark
Yeah.
figure, I'm thinking that we're going to have a virtual brain. And so these machine learning problems are going to be new. We're going to have a computer that can simulate a human brain and can solve any of these cognitive problems that we're talking about. So my question is, at what point do we start looking at this economic system and admitting to ourselves that we're not going to be able to compete with these robots, and that maybe this whole competition framework is the actual problem, and then we should find better ways to survive without competing with each other or the robots?
Okay, good. So, so really your two questions, or one is, or maybe it's not a question, assertion, we will have a virtual brain in 20 years, and then the second question is what if, right? What if that's true? So let me say on the first one, I may or may not agree. Okay, I don't agree, but let's take it as let's take it as given that that would be true. Okay, so what would that imply if that were the case for economically? I think that. Sure. Okay. So what does that imply economically? So there's sort of two answers, right? One is, of course, well, that's great, right? Because now we have all of the, it's like at the end of Spinal Tap. If I, you say, well, what do you think of this life of sex and drugs and rock and roll? And he says, well, if I could have sex and drugs, I could do without the rock and roll. Well, sort of if we, if we could have all the consumption without all the work, right? That would be even better, right? That's a glib answer, but it says if we actually have a world where we have achieved that level of technological progress, we have tremendous material prosperity. The problem that we would have is one of distribution, right? What is your claim to those resources, right? And this is the problem, or what I alluded to earlier about labor scarcity, right? That your claim to present and future resources comes from the fact that you possess a set of skills that it doesn't have an abundant, cheap source of supply, and so people need to pay you to do your work. If they could get your work done without paying you, they'd probably prefer that, like that even more, right? So the challenge we would face is one of income distribution, that we would have both, material riches and lots of leisure, but how would the leisure class get a piece of those resources? And I think that's that would be a huge problem were it to occur. And it's possible that it will. But, I go back and forth in my own mind about this all the time. One could have told the same story a century ago. In fact, Karl Marx did, said, once we have all this capital advances, all the wealth will belong to the owners of capital. Workers will be redundant, superfluous, and therefore marginalized. And even as Marx was writing, actually, wages were rising. He didn't know that. He couldn't have known that. But they were rising, and labor's share of national income was rising. So it doesn't mean he couldn't have been 100 years before his time, right? But so far, we have primarily educated ourselves and made ourselves complementary to the new set of activities that we have made necessary. So I worry about it. I don't think I have exactly the same concerns as you, but I do think if we got to that point, it would be very challenging. Yes? Sure. Sure. So there's no question that there will be sectors that will be automated out of existence, and there have been many, and and that's been true for many, many periods. So that will definitely happen. The greater concern of whether there are sort of classes of broad skill groups that will be sort of automated out of decent wage income. And we already see that too, right? So people who have less than a high school education in the U.S. Cannot really, in general, attain a sustainable standard of living, right? We have, even though we have many fewer skilled jobs than we used to, or sorry, many fewer skilled people than we used. Excuse me, let's try that one on that. Even though we have many fewer low-education people than we used to, or less skilled people than we used to, they're still way too numerous relative to the number of jobs that are demanding them. So in terms of solutions to that, there are a variety of them, and I think that you should think of them as complements rather than substitutes, right? So one thing we do is we invest in people to make them more productive, right? That's what our education system does to a very substantial extent. That's what our healthcare system does as well, right? It enables people to be productive. Another thing we should do is we should subsidize things that are complementary to work, that allow and make it sustainable for people to work. So, for example, the earned income tax credit is a large wage subsidy to low-wage workers. It both raises their standard of living and makes work more attractive, right? It's not a subsidy to leisure. Other things one can do is one can make sure health care is broadly available. One can subsidize child care, right? All these things that are complementary to work. I personally get much more anxious in thinking about a universal basic income that is not tied to work, because I think work, this is very non-economic of me to say, but I actually think work is a good. It's not just a bad, and that it gives people identity, organization, meaning, and objectives, and without those things, most people don't do as well. So there are, the countries like Norway and Denmark and so on have high labor force participation rates and very high social transfers, but most of those transfers are in the form of work-based complements, things that basically make work relatively more attractive relative to leisure, even though leisure is pretty good in those countries if you've tried it. Yes, and then yes.
Yeah, I guess one of my observations, I don't know if it's necessarily a concern, about technology is the relative transformation in terms of the composition of output, in terms of the amount of money we spend, not necessarily in terms of the physical output. For example, the fact that consumer services are much less amenable to technological substitutions than manufacturing or transportation, or maybe even mining. We've seen a decrease in the price of mining, transportation, manufacturing. Service prices maybe even have risen, and as a share of national income, they continue to rise. And at some point, that would probably slow down productivity unless services can also be comparably audited. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so the idea goes back to Bill Baumol, right, and the notion that basically sectors that are technologically lagging, i.e. don't have high rates of productivity growth, tend to become more expensive over time, right? So, symphony orchestras, which have had no productivity increase that anyone can measure, right, have basically become too expensive for anyone to go to. Or if you want to go see a play, right, it's all labor, and it's become more expensive relative to the cost of buying a big screen television set, right? In general, what that means is slow growth but lots of employment, right? So it's slightly different from the concern that many people have about lack of employment due to rapid growth. But I think it's interesting to ask whether we're going to get a lot more productive at some of these things. One area that we spend a huge amount on that we could become much more productive at is education, right? And it's possible. I mean, my view is there haven't been many important educational innovations since sort of the blackboard. But maybe that's changing, right? Maybe we'll figure out how to provide a lot more effective education to a lot more people at lower cost. So that's one way in which we could enable this. Hopefully in healthcare, something similar could happen. If we could get more productive at just those two things, right, that would make a huge difference to the aggregate. But others of these things won't. And so some of them will become too expensive to bother with, and others will continue to employ large numbers of workers. Right? So cleaning services may be in that latter category, at least for a while. Yes, sir.
Based on what you just said about the question you said, the jobs may exist, but require problem solving and different cognitive skills. Where are those things necessarily being produced in the education system we have now, or how might we go about doing that? There's all kinds of stories about how many people with college degrees or in jobs that require college degrees
there's not necessarily that link. So is there a kind of educational thing that you see, whether it's a college degree or even a high school degree, but some kind of way to increase that cognitive skill?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a very challenging and important question. We have a lot of, if you measure education by inputs, i.e. the amount of time people spend sitting in chairs listening to lectures, right, we're doing great. If you measure in terms of outputs, in terms of what people have actually accomplished, not so good. And the U.S. in particular has a kind of a high input, low output model, right? Our rate of, the amount that people tend to learn in high school, for example, is pretty low, which is part of the reason so many people need to go to college, in fact, to remediate, right? And also part of the reason that so many people drop out of college because they're already not well prepared. So I think we can hope to get much, much better at education. I think this is an area where we now have better tools for assessment, better technology, better ways of providing access to information. So in theory, we're potentially at an era where we could all of a sudden make significant progress on this. Will we? Hard to say. I mean, if providing access to information was all that it took, libraries would have solved the mass education problem hundreds of years ago, right? So it must be true that there's something else that goes on in educational institutions other than just providing access to information that helps people acquire skills. I'm a believer in the idea that we now have more opportunities to get better than we did even 10 years ago. I think that's one of the great challenges and opportunities that we face. I think everyone, this is something I hope people will advance on. We clearly haven't found the recipe, right? People don't know how to do MOOCs in a way, massively online, that really substitute, that have completion rates higher than 15%, and in general, the people who benefit most from these technologies are people who are already good at classroom learning, right? So hopefully we can figure out a way to democratize that much more substantially. Yes, sir.
Post-imperialism, World War II era, the developing areas have been gotten the biggest boost out of cheap labor, and that's been what driven them to develop so quickly compared to the already developed.
Mm-hmm.
With the implementation of the technology that can replace much of this cheaper labor, will the developing world be able to keep up with the capital investment necessary to stay up with the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, there are a couple of forces at work, right? So, I mean, countries that have started off with cheap labor have, become much more developed and not having cheap labor, right? Japan and Korea would be good examples, right? China is moving towards not being cheap labor, right? China is not the cheapest place to hire workers in Asia anymore. In general, cheap labor has never itself been a great development strategy, right? It can only be a catalyst that produces resources, but then you have to invest it in other things, right? And the countries that have gone from being very underdeveloped to being very wealthy have been countries that have gone from taking their cheap labor, getting resources, and parlaying that into investments in other in human capital and physical capital, in creating products and ideas. Africa now is growing much more rapidly. The last decade has been much better for Africa than any decade past in quite a while. Partly that's because of investment. Partly that's the effect. Part of that's from investment from China and investment in resources there. If that isn't used to, if it's just about taking advantage of cheap resources and doesn't lead to skills development, doesn't lead to institution building, doesn't lead to creation of new ideas in industry, then it will play itself out. It will not continue, right? So I think it creates an opportunity, but I think the concern you expressed is one I share, that what if the technology improves so fast that even that source of comparative advantage of cheap labor wasn't much of an advantage at all, right? And partly that depends on how rapidly things change, right? So if tomorrow Amazon introduced a $1,000 domestic service robot that could cook and clean and drive your kids to school and mow your lawn, right? And you could get it free on Amazon Prime overnight, or only $4.99 for overnight, I'm sorry, 2-day shipping for free, that would be extremely disruptive, right? Many people would buy one. It would be a great thing, but it would obviously, for a lot of people who do that for a living, that would be extremely disruptive development and would certainly reduce their incomes, right? Because they wouldn't have an equally good thing to do. So part of it depends on how fast this changes. My prediction, my opinionated and relatively uninformed prediction is it's not happening that fast. And the people who I hang out with at MIT, I think MIT is actually a particularly pessimistic place about this stuff. My understanding in the realm of computer science, think it's still, things are moving, where progress is being made, but it's relatively incremental. But that's just a prediction. Yep. No, it's actually converging. I mean, this is where we're actually, I mean, that's for a long time it was a huge puzzle in economics why countries were diverging instead of converging, which is what you would predict based on the kind of neoclassical growth model. And now we're actually in a period where big chunks of the world are catching up, and growth rates have slowed a lot in the highly developed world. So no, I think actually this is much as from our point of view things don't look as rosy as they might have one time. From a more global perspective, and if you could ignore all the sort of war and killing, things are looking okay.
So you mentioned that the U.S. was declining with their advantage with education over the rest of the world. What are the effects of that economically as other countries surpass us in education capital?
Well, I think it's not that so much the being surpassed per se, but it suggests that we're not investing as successfully as other places, not doing what we could do, and it has substantial implications for real earnings levels, for people who are more educated have in many ways better lives, right? They have higher earnings, they have happier marriages, they vote more. They seem generally, there appear to be benefits of education that are both pecuniary and non-pecuniary, that extend well beyond the earnings levels that come with it. So it's unfortunate that we're, not reaching the potential that was clearly must be reachable, right? So I think in that sense, I don't think we're worse off because other nations are better educated. I think we're worse off because we're not as well educated as we could be, and it's not for lack of expenditure on it. Right? It's not like it's because U.S. kids don't go to school or we don't, provide colleges, right? But somehow we don't put the pieces together as well as we could. Yes.
Why do you think that education improves human capital, or at least let's say that 100% of the purpose of education is improving human capital rather than signaling potentials? Right? So you mentioned you saw earlier that the people who have some college, right, particularly the people who drop out of this semester or graduate, they should be one semester short of their college premium, right? But in fact they're not. Right? And as you've seen, like we've had substantial growth in the amount of bachelor's degrees, but the people who marginally got their bachelor's degrees do not seem to be doing much better than would have. So it seems like there's an entire coterie of factors that is not explained by the view that education is 100% about improving human capital rather than sorting that capital.
So I agree that education is not 100% about that, but I don't think it's 100% not about that. If it were just a signaling game and it was just about determining who was more capable ex ante and nothing about value added, it seems hard to believe that we wouldn't have found out some more efficient way of doing that, right? Or employers wouldn't have figured out, how to make good use of low-skilled workers. After all, they're getting cheaper and cheaper, and yet people aren't buying them. So I think it's certainly not the case, that education is exclusively about raising productivity. That we could argue there are many other benefits. It's also the case that there's lots of consumption benefits of education that have nothing to do with going to college, that are not intrinsically educational. And I'm sure there's some element of signaling as well, right? That basically if you can, make it through MIT, who cares if you're an engineer? We still want you on Wall Street, right? That's fine. But I don't think that explains, and I don't think there's evidence to suggest that that's most of what's going on. Did you want to? It seemed like you wanted. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned that so if there were a way to efficiently sort workers according to their human capital,
Yeah.
that employers would have seized upon, right? And I want to ask, is there a way of doing that? And has that way been made illegal in the vast majority of employment sectors? That is an IQ test.
So, I mean, first of all, I want to say I don't think I think the point I was making is that education adds value, not simply signaling. So in other words, people are getting more productive, right? I mean, you wouldn't say, I mean, no, I never hear anyone make the argument that, elementary school is just signaling. I'm not going to send my kid there, right? Clearly there's a lot, if you watch your kids from age, 6 to 16, you'll see they actually learn a lot of skills, and those skills are going to be helpful to them. Could employers do a better job if they could use more invasive tests? Potentially. But they're pretty sophisticated, actually. I mean, employers have a lot of alternatives to IQ tests that turn out to be, like IQ tests. I'm not sure. I mean, it's an interesting question. I shouldn't, off the top of my head, I can't say how large the gains would be from that. Certainly, there are some cost to having rules that, produce equity at a cost potentially of some efficiency. So let me take. Okay, this gentleman, because you're yeah.
I was wondering if our educational system providing the right skills. There are I mean, for example, it's not as extreme here, but if you go to Greece, the average waiter has 4 years.
Yeah. Is it producing the right skills? Well, I think there are. I think it's producing too little. Right, so I think there are many people who go, a good example would be the for-profit colleges, which provide expensive but not very substantive degrees, right? I think, the right skills are actually very, are not exotic. To a substantial extent, they're good analytical skills, good communication skills, good writing skills, good interpersonal skills. If you have those things, you can succeed in many domains. That obviously doesn't make you an oil field engineer if you just have those things, right? But in general, you can have a good standard of living. The debate about STEM, which is talked about a lot, there's no question that STEM workers earn more. And maybe if we better prepared people through math and sciences through primary and secondary school, more of them would choose STEM fields, right? So that would probably, so that you could argue is a loss. And you could also argue that there are some social benefits, right? That having a lot of highly skilled people in technology creates kind of national wealth in a variety of ways, right? So, at the margin, I'm in favor of improving the quality of education there. I think that the main problem with our educational system is, well, I don't know what the main problem is. I don't want to take that on, but let me say a big problem is it just, for the amount of resources and time used, the outputs are not what they could be. It has what you would say called low total factor productivity. And hopefully, a combination of rising costs and increasing technological opportunities and a recognition of its importance could help improve this over time. If it could, that would be a wonderful thing. Okay. Thank you very much for your questions.